In today's episode, we're going to focus on some new research and a framework for resetting strategy during the recovery. And what's interesting now is that, of course, everywhere you look, there are terms to describe the phases of response and what's happening. Tell us about Gartner's framework for thinking about those phases and why you settled on that approach in particular.
Sure, Jackie. Yes, the main thing is we wanted to keep it fairly simple, but we also wanted to make sure that it aligned with the pandemic response language, which is established outside of Gartner. So if you look at the World Health Organization, for example, they talk about very specific phases of reaction to this particular type of disruption. What I wanted to do with the team, though, was to cast it into more of truly a reset language in terms of what are the decisions that we can make now to change what happens as we go forward. So it's a response, and in part it's a business response, yes, but it's also a response for the public sector, for governments. It's a response for parts of society, and so on. But the main idea is that there's an action happening right now that has moved past just the initial response and into a more thoughtful phase of thinking forward and actually thinking of how do I reset aspects of who I am and who my business is.
Right. So, and I know that you've been talking to our clients about pandemic response right from the earliest moments of the outbreak before it even was a pandemic. So why does it help to even have this kind of a framework to be thinking about the journey in stages, and what does that help you do to be addressing it through this kind of a framework?
Sure, and actually the use of the word framework here is really important. I mean, I come from a deep technical background, and there are all kinds of frameworks for language and that developers use. And the purpose of a framework is to simplify something that's complex as a way of parsing it into manageable chunks. Because it would be bad if all we did was be in a constant chaotic response to a situation and never kind of move past that. That's a natural part of what happens when human beings are faced with some kind of a disruption. All they thought they knew breaks apart, and you start experimenting, but you're also experimenting at a time when you're trying to solve problems that are emergent and happen, in matters of minutes and hours and days. And so what the framework does is it gives you kind of a logical way to step back and say, okay, what's actually happening here, and how are the activities in each of these phases different? How do I actually shift my energy and the attention of people and their efforts to the appropriateness of the phase that they're in? What makes this, I think, challenging is that it's not the only set of phases happening. You have the relatively unknown phase of the disease itself. And there are various models that project out through the next year, 18 months or so. And we have yet to understand what's actually going to happen there. And there is a good chance that actually these phases get triggered again. So if we have a resurgence of disease in different parts of the world, even right now as we're speaking, the Southern Hemisphere is entering its flu season. And so you have the first experience of the flu being combined with COVID as it emerges in those places. And so there's so many unknowns right now. What the framework does is it gives us a way to kind of logically think about it so that we're not always in just chaotic action all the time.
Right. So I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions about this. So I am going to take a minute just to remind people that Chris will take questions at the end of this conversation. So if you have any questions for Chris, just enter them in the comments box and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. So back to this reset idea. I've also heard you talk about this being a means to build resilience in the organization. So can you speak to that a little bit too?
Sure, absolutely. So you think about the three phases of the reset. You have the response phase, you have the recovery phase, and you have the renewal phase, and they overlap. And the truth is that when the disruption began back in the early part of 2020, when I would be talking to corporate directors or CEOs, they were already at that point thinking, okay, how do we come out of this? They were thinking in the renewal phase at that point right there. But as I said earlier, things broke. A lot of things broke in terms of operating models, for example, the way that we would, even just what a customer was or a patient was changed dramatically. The channels that we would use to serve them changed. In some places, things completely shut down. In other places, demand completely increased. And what happened, the first indicators that we saw of this in the Far East, of course, was in supply chain. So supply chains started to break apart, especially as whole parts of the world shut down. And what we learned from studying this, which gets to the resilience message, is that we had tuned so many things to be ultra efficient, which is great when it's not disrupted. But the thing about efficiency is that it actually can create brittleness or rigidity. And what we're really looking at now is to say, well, how do we not do that again? How do we maintain some operational efficiency, but also make it very resilient so that as things happen in the environment, we have the ability to flex around it? And that resilience is on multiple levels. So clearly there's an IT architecture perspective, which is highly modular and very flexible and event-driven. But it's more than just that. Are my people flexible? Are they trained to be able to do multiple things in the face of disruption? Is my org structure, does it allow information to flow clearly through the org structure as a way of getting information to people when they need it, as they need it? Clearly in supply chain is, do I have the ability to quickly switch as things break in different parts of the supply chain? That also has to do with information supply chain and where my workloads are running in the cloud. How quickly could I move them around? And so what happened is that we've learned this lesson in a difficult way, this sort of polarity between efficiency and resilience. And we have this narrow window right now, which is why we're having this conversation about resetting strategy, is that if the epidemiological models suggest strongly that there will be a second wave of the virus in the latter part of 2020, we have a window of time right now to actually make some decisions and determine how we make ourselves more resilient in the face of that. And that's the type of activity that we're starting to see across our clients, is they're thinking about changing the nature of work. They're aggressively going after data-driven strategies, artificial intelligence, machine learning as a way to sense the environment and change and be resilient. So the resilience message is a really important one. The other thing about it, I think just from a human point of view, it's hopeful. That most people are feeling really kind of raw right now, and many parts of the world have been under lockdown for a long time. When we start talking about building the future or resilience, that is a hopeful, forward-looking thing, but it's also very practical and very active. And so it serves a business purpose, but it also serves just a pure human psychological purpose as well.
Right. So, I mean, what you're describing is sort of a combination of the strategy slate wiped clean and being extremely complex at the same time. So how does that translate into what this actually means for strategic decision making? How
Sure,
has this changed the way we approach strategy setting?
Well, I think there are two things. One is, we have to plan for the very near future, and we have to do it in an options-based way. Because of the unknowns in the model itself, it doesn't make much sense to try to plan something active for 3 to 5 years out right now. A lot of the clients that I'm talking to are trying to plan for December and thinking about what options do we have to be able to enact at that point, depending on where this goes. So it moves from a sort of traditional longer phase strategic planning to a much shorter phased options-based strategy planning. And there needs to be agility in that process. And this, to be honest, is where a lot of companies have trouble, because their strategy making processes before weren't agile. It was, in some ways, it's quite an encumbered ritualistic experience that happens once a year and maybe gets enacted. The execution of strategy is uneven. We don't have the luxury of that right now. We really need to be very clear about what could happen. What do we need to do, say, within our business architecture to help us scale out of this situation and to survive it, so that we enter 2021 in a place where we can actually start to then grow again. It's going to stay hard, though. I mean, 2021, from all indications, is going to be a difficult year financially. It's going to be better, hopefully, than where we end up in the short term here. But in terms of there being an accelerated growth, all the models that I'm seeing, the economic models, don't show that. And so this idea of strategy within the short term and fiscal responsibility along with that prepares us for the longer haul through the end of 2021. So options-based strategy, agile strategy, and the ability to change course as the models around us change.
So that's going to be a different approach for a lot of people. What does that mean about the actual skills required to get that done? Are we in good shape for the skills that you'll need to get that done?
Mm. I'd love to say yes, I really would, and but the truth is, it's going to involve some business, some muscle building, the different business muscles. We're going to have to build them up and do it relatively quickly, but it's all possible. The trick is, in some ways, we inherit from agile development, continuous delivery, continuous integration. Those disciplines, if you remove kind of the building technical stuff from it, is about what do we know now, how do we need to act, having regular quick stand-ups to say, just a clearinghouse of information. What do we know this week that we didn't know last week, and so on. So it's a communication thing is in many ways, and that's a different mindset, especially if you are very much in an engineering mindset, and that's the way the company is built. It's a shift from that. So that's really key. But it really is, if you look at it at a human level, maybe it becomes easier. So it's about transparency, what I call ruthless transparency. So you know what you know, and everybody knows the same thing. You have the trusted ability to act as a collection of people, as opposed to there being a strict or hierarchical flow. Sometimes we just need to get with the people that can help us solve the problem and enact that problem, learn from it, and then continue on from there. And so it is transparency, it is communication, and it's trust. And what I'm seeing that I find really encouraging is on that last part, the trust part. As organizations of all different types, and society itself has had to work together quickly in the face of this disruption, we're building new bonds of trust that I think will last, ultimately will last. It is also, of course, causing us to question who we are and what we've done, and whether the assumptions and the policies and the ways we thought about things are still true. And it's bringing a lot of that to the surface across different dimensions for reconsideration. And so as much as we might talk about a business reset, there are aspects of society reset happening now, and there are aspects of other human resets happening as well. And they're not all easy. I mean, in many ways, they're painful to go through, because it is an acknowledgement of the need to change something. Now, in the business perspective, one of the things we hear, of course, is that culture is the thing that keeps us from changing. Well, you can't use that excuse anymore. You need to figure out how to leverage the culture that you have to actually move things forward. Transparency, communication, and trust.
So I can actually see that there's questions coming in already that we're going to want to answer in a minute. And we were going to finish up by talking just a little bit about, although you've been over a lot of this already, talking about whether what should we expect to see and do in this strategy setting cycle that we've never seen before. You've already spoken to a lot of those things, but what would you say if you're talking about a typical, well, there's no longer a typical planning cycle.
Yeah.
Is that the response, that there is no typical planning cycle anymore?
Yeah, so there still will be planning cycles. So for example, we're still headed into a budget cycle right now, and so thinking towards 2021, but it's really a balance of paradoxes. I think, and it's acknowledging those paradoxes as part of strategy making that is brought to the fore. That's the thing for me that feels really different. So for example, the efficiency versus resilience conversation, that's one. Or cost optimization or cost avoidance versus investment, that's another one. And so the budget processes that we're walking into have to take that into account. It's certain that some of the things we were doing coming into 2020, we're not going to keep doing. That we'll pause that or we'll kill them outright. But there are a number of places that we're seeing where there's doubling down on investment, because there's a belief that if we do that thing right, say the application of advanced analytics for prescriptive analysis, that's actually part of what's going to help us survive. So you have this not just sort of broad across the board decision making, but rather this nuanced balancing of paradoxes. And that is the essence of scenario planning. But what I'm talking about here is scenario planning brought down into the instant and creation of multiple options. So that's how it looks different. And in the same way that we move from in development, so in IT development, say, a lot of organizations have moved from that very long planful waterfall methodology towards more of a continuous delivery methodology. That's what's going to happen with strategy, is moving from the long-term ritualistic strategy setting to something that's much more agile and context aware. And so, yes, it's a different set of skills, but that's what we need. And what I've seen, and to be encouraging about it, that's what I've seen over the last few months, is not just people running around with their hair on fire, but rather, how do we solve this problem? How do we do it quickly? And how do we do it together? It's maintaining that energy as part of strategy making that will help organizations move forward.
So that actually links in nicely to the first question we have, because Dave from Boston asks, or says, I know already that the heads of business units and functions in my company won't like taking an adaptive approach to strategy. Any advice? And I think there's sort of two parts to that. One is, will they need to? And I think you've made clear they will need to. What advice do you give to an executive who feels that this is the way they need to go? They're attempting an agile approach, but they're sort of meeting roadblocks in the way they have those conversations.
Yeah, so the technique that I'm seeing a lot of organizations use, and we've been using with clients, is really a look at the business architecture itself. Because if you say, I'm going to change the entire business and I'm going to create an option-based strategy for the entire enterprise, well, yeah, that's not going to work. What we need to do is create options-based strategies for those parts of our business portfolio where doing it wrong is really going to be bad, and where we actually have to place the energy to make quick decisions. And that will be inconsistent across the business architecture, which is good, because you don't want all of that to be the same. And so where are you talking with line of business executives and so on, to get their sense of what has been disrupted in their business itself and how quickly those solutions need to come. Because if you can narrow the scope of that, all of a sudden it feels much more manageable. And in a complex organization, that's the way we should be doing things generally, but it's especially true right now. Focus on the business architecture, heat map it, keep the focus down to what needs to be changed, and then exercise the strategy making around those attributes so it doesn't feel like an enormous, impossible task.
Right. Okay, we have another question from Mukul in Singapore, who asks, how do you plan phase timing when the world is moving at a different pace in each country?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just for that.
Yeah. It's an excellent question, and there's not really an easy answer to it, other than you have to plan it geographically. So Singapore, for example, you guys are further ahead in terms of response to this. So reopening is happening more quickly. If there's a second wave, you'll also feel it more quickly there. And so if I'm a multinational doing business in Singapore, there are things about that, that part of the business where I can move faster. But the trick is to learn from that for rest of world. So just as a Gartner example, we've reopened our offices in mainland China, in Beijing and Shanghai, and we did it, ahead of rest of world, because it was ready for that to be done. But we redesigned the facilities, we changed the nature of the shift work. We had to change a number of things to actually make that possible, that we're learning as we apply across the rest of the footprint. So it's going to take geographic planning for that. And in a more subtle way, absolutely. So add location to the business architecture, and you end up getting at that nuance. What I would say as well, I've been dealing with a lot of the oil and gas companies lately, the major companies, and of course they have operation environments in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a part of the world that hasn't been hit by the virus yet. And what we're learning there is, how do we apply the new practices that we've learned in terms of how to keep employees safe and healthy, how to get information distributed, the nature of automation in the work, what can be applied in those environments before that wave really hits. And so it's a learning, whereas we have the opportunity to learn as this moves around the world, especially in our complex environments, to learn what works and what doesn't.
And I think this is interesting because we've also talked about how it's not only different geographies that are at different phases, there's even different parts of the same organization which are going to have to respond differently. So maybe you can speak a little bit to that, because I think that's an interesting challenge that people maybe haven't thought through.
It is, yeah. It is. Thanks for that, Jackie. So the way that we're studying it, and the interesting thing, I've talked, and some of you heard me talk about the fact that this is really a liminal moment. Now, what does that mean? Liminal is a term that comes from rituals, and basically it's that point in a ritual where everybody has crossed in to the middle of the ritual, but you haven't exited it yet, and so everybody's kind of stripped down to the same level of knowledge, and we haven't actually entered into the next phase yet. What makes this both fascinating and frustrating and a little scary is we're in that time altogether, including Gartner. So we're studying companies as they're going through it in as close to real time as we can get. And the way that we're trying to do that, again, use of frameworks, is looking at it through a business model lens and an operating model lens. Because if you do that, then you can figure out, well, how does that apply to different parts of the business? So for example, yeah, we may be, not we, Gartner, but in general, we may be opening offices, but we still have to do sales and customer service in a much more remote way than we did before. So those things that we invented to make that possible need to be strengthened and actually probably become part of the go forward strategy generally, that actually we learned things from that and we keep it. So there's that pattern. So what we're doing is studying patterns in the business model. So think about it in 4 ways. There's the value proposition. What do I do that creates value? And that can be consumer or commercial value. It can be public sector value. It can be healthcare, whatever. It is the thing that I'm producing that there is a need for. And then how do I get it to people? And then who are those people? Or who are the partners in a B2B environment? Who am I actually providing this to, and how are they changing? And analyzing the changing nature of, let's call them customer behavior, and how I need to adapt to that. Then you have the financial model. So in some ways, we've had to find very quickly new sources of revenue or new ways to control costs. And some of that then will play forward and applies in different ways across the business. And then the fourth of this is capabilities, which includes the tech capabilities and process, but also very importantly, employees and ecosystem. And so a technique that we're starting to see emerge there to study sort of variances across a complex footprint is to do employee journey mapping. So many of you do customer journey mapping. What we're starting to see is employee journey mapping, and then combined with customer journey mapping to figure out how are humans interacting with each other, with systems and so on, and how can I modify that for different parts of the business. So through the business model and into the operating model. And so the case studies that we're starting to produce are looking at these complex organizations in exactly that way.
So this is an interesting question that we have here. Francisco from Panama asks, how important is top-down communication in the company during this new reality? And of course, everything that you're describing is not a top-down environment. So how does top-down communication work? How necessary is it? What is the role of top-down communication right now?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Francisco. This is a really, really important point. Because in many organizations, hierarchy has been challenged, mostly for information flow, decision making, and action. But that doesn't mean that top-down messaging isn't really important. It's important in a very specific way, in that there needs to be a very clearly communicated vision about how we are responding to this as an organization. What are the actions we're taking and why? And so if there are hard things, for example, like reduction in force or aggressive cost management that actually has an impact on people in the organization, that's much easier if people understand why it's happening and what the role is and what the future looks like as far as people can see, as far as executive management can see. So it's really back to ruthless transparency and trust. Do I trust my senior leaders to be doing the right decisions, not just for themselves or for the business, but rather that which includes me as employee? Because the companies that do that wrong, and we've seen some examples of that, there's a very long downstream effect to that when hiring starts to open back up again and employees have a choice of where they will go to work. One of the things that they're looking at very carefully, we'll be looking at, is, well, how did you treat your people and how did you communicate during the time of crisis itself? So this becomes a very important role for senior management. The other thing, of course, they have to do is to be flexible to this kind of options-based strategy that I'm talking about. and provide cover for that, to say, yes, this is what we need to do. And so if they're expressing vision correctly, and then the openness to options-based strategy, then that will tend to work better than if there is still a sort of a top-down control of everything that's done, because that will mute or attenuate the survival instincts of the rest of the organization. And that would be a really bad place to end up.
Right. Well, thanks, Chris. I think we'll bring it to a close there, but thanks so much for this conversation today. It is, as we said, unprecedented times, but this has given us some actionable things to think about. For those of you watching, for more information on the reset idea, you can get more from an article written by Chris on Smarter with Gartner. So that's gartner.com/Smarter with Gartner. And just returning to a second to the issue of diversity and equity and inclusion, we also have resources and insights available from Gartner on that, also available via gartner.com. So thanks very much for joining us today. Thanks, Chris. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Jackie. Hope everybody stays safe and healthy, please.